Work it, make it, do it, make sense.
Good morning. How are we all feeling? A little bit tired from last night? I hope you had a good time. Today I'll be talking about the Geek's Guide to Leading Teams. I'd like to find out how many of you are actually currently leading a team of some sort. So if you could put your hand up. Okay, that's good. So for you, I guess you understand some of the experiences and challenges of maybe leading a technical team. For other people who maybe aren't yet sort of leading a team, what I hope to give you is a set of expectations of how you might prepare yourself to deal with those situations you might find yourself in. I've done a lot of sort of training of people who've been moving into this role, and I think what's quite fascinating is a lot of the experiences that you have as a developer don't really prepare you for the experiences of leading for a team. And it requires quite a different set of skills, and I hope to impart with you some of those ideas about how you might go about approaching it, as well as some tools that you can sort of draw upon. So I work for a company called ThoughtWorks, and ThoughtWorks you probably might know through a couple of the things that we've sort of created, like continuous delivery. You might know about Martin Fowler, who writes a lot on his sort of website. And we've also produced this thing called the Technology Radar. And we're a global consultancy, and the Tech Radar is our kind of view of what we're seeing with clients around the world. It might be of interest to you as technologists to understand what industry trends that we're actually seeing with clients. And we kind of end up classifying those sorts of tools, techniques into sort of different areas, and then also give advice as to what things you might be interested in adopting or trialing, or maybe putting on hold as well. So it's an exercise that I'd highly recommend you run within your own company as well to help sort of create a direction. And it's something that you might be interested in terms of understanding what the current industry from our perspective is. Now, I work as a technical lead most of the time when I work with our clients. So what that means is I'm also leading development teams. And as a consultancy, one of our sort of roles is actually about sort of upskilling people in that sort of perspective as well. Throughout this process, I've actually talked to quite a lot of people, and it kind of ended up resulting in a book called Talking with Tech Leads. And for me, it's quite an interesting experience talking to a lot of people who've been through this journey. I kind of talk to people who are on their beginning journey, and that sort of shock value. And maybe for people who are currently in this role, you can kind of empathize with that, which is the, oh my goodness, I was a developer, and now I'm leading. What does that actually mean? And then I also talked to a whole bunch of people who've been doing this role for a while and understanding about how they go about approaching it, what they emphasize. And I think a lot of this is really about sort of some lessons learned and also understanding that there is no real one true perfect way of being a tech lead. And I think that's a really key element of when you actually take on this role of being comfortable with yourself, your approach, and understanding that people have different ways of being an effective tech lead. I guess I want to start off with maybe asking this question about, well, why is it that we actually need a tech lead? Do we even need one? What happens if we just get a bunch of developers together and just let them go off? And the analogy I tend to think about this is when you're actually working your own sort of personal project. So maybe you have something that is your own sort of open source sort of project, something that you're hacking together at home, something that you're actually doing. You have this goal in mind. And if it's just you have this idea about what you'd actually like to achieve, you don't really need to explain it to people. You kind of work in small steps towards that goal of what you have, and hopefully you end up achieving whatever it is that you have. Now, in a lot of our sort of environments, our sort of companies, organizations, we don't get to work by ourselves a lot, right? So software is a lot more complex today. There's a lot more moving parts, and it requires a whole bunch of skills that it's very difficult to develop by yourself, and also to scale that really rapidly. So it's very rare that we end up working by ourselves, and we often end up working in sort of teams of people. And what that means is that we kind of have the same goal, but there's a whole bunch of people that also need to understand that. And so when you're actually leading a team, it might be really simple in your head about saying, okay, here is what we're trying to achieve, and you sort of say that once, and you sort of expect people to sort of understand what that goal is. And in your mind, you kind of think that everyone understands what that is, and they know how to get to that goal pretty clearly. And so people kind of think about how actually everyone's working towards this environment. Now, this is a really nice, idealistic sort of world, and unfortunately, that's not what really happens in the real life. So often what happens is you have this whole bunch of people, and people are starting to think about maybe what that goal is and what it means to them. And they've been thinking about other things. And what ends up happening is that everyone has their own sort of priorities, and people start moving off in different directions. So one person might be thinking, this is the chance where I get to implement React or Angular. Another person might be, oh, this is my chance to understand how to do TDD properly because it's the first time I get to do things. For other people, it might be, I just get to work with a whole bunch of people and learn a whole bunch of things. And you might have that one person that remembers what that goal is and understands how to get there. And if you've ever worked on a team like this, and I see this all the time, it can be really frustrating, right? So people are working on different things. There's not really that sort of sense of priority. And maybe you don't experience this in your current team, and I think that's really great. And I think it's just important to understand that not every team is exactly the same. And you might think that this doesn't really happen in the real world. And I think this tweet summarizes it quite well. So Julian's a good friend of mine, and he talks about how I had 10 guys on my last project, all of them had opinions, and all of them were expressed in the code base. How many people of you might have seen something like this? Right. So what happens to this leadership of the common understanding about what we're going towards and also how we get there together? And for me, this is really a simple test that you can think about if you're being effective. So if you are being an effective tech lead, then my question to you is, does the code base look like it was written by a single person? So in reality, it's never really going to look exactly the same. So even as developers ourselves, we learn, we grow, we probably understand some of the different patterns, and we might evolve that over time. But when I look at sort of code bases, what I'm really looking for is maybe through sort of a bit of a squinting kind of view, just generally, does the code base look kind of similar? And this isn't really about sort of code styles, although that's part of it. It's also about how we approach those problems. So do we approach things like persistence in a common fashion? Do we approach the same types of problems in the same sorts of fashions? Or do you end up seeing 6 or 7 different implementations of solving that same sort of core problem? And I think what's really hard is that we put a lot of pressure on team members to go and write features and functionality. And often we don't help people understand the guidance and connect them to other people who've maybe implemented something like that. And it's a challenge, right? So every developer likes to create everything from scratch. We get this buzz from solving problems constantly. And particularly if we get to solve it in our own way, we like to have our own personal style. But that personal style starts to create problems when we're actually talking about it at a larger scale. So if we think about maintainability, if we have the 10 different ways of doing the same thing in the code base, the next thing that we do might be really hard to actually add because we have to make a change to all of those 10 parts. And so we actually care about consistency at the team level, and this is hopefully something that you as a tech lead can help shepherd and guide the team to actually resolve. So this is your kind of simple guide and test as to whether or not you're being effective. But what do you actually focus on as part of this role? And throughout this talk, I kind of want to talk about 3 main areas to help you understand where you focus your time. So we're tech leads, and naturally that means we're technical, right? So there's an aspect of the development side, the programming, that we actually have to care about. And one of the first traps that you might fall into as a first-time tech lead is focusing exclusively on the programming side. So as a developer, you might be kind of falling into your habits of wanting to fix and create all the sort of problems in the sort of code base or solve the new problems that are coming up. But it's not the only element of what you should be focusing on in this leadership role. And this brings us on to the people side, which is we actually have to make sure that we devote explicit thinking time and time to make sure that we understand the team that we have, and are they working towards the same sort of vision. And finally, I kind of want to cover sort of the process or the environment in which the team works. So it's not really enough to just simply think about the technical side or people individually, but also understand the sort of system in which everyone is interacting. And we'll cover each of these different areas one by one. So the first one we'll talk about is really about programming. And my first question here is, do effective technical leaders need to code? Who says yes? Okay. Who says no? Okay, bit of a mix. So in my experience, I find it's very helpful for a lot of people to write code. And I'll talk about why in a second. The next question that often a lot of people have is, well, how much time is enough? And my rule of thumb here is kind of thinking about this kind of 30% time, a minimum of 30% time, spending time with the code. And my guide to you is not necessarily writing code 30% explicitly. It's really thinking about how you spend time understanding what's going on in that code base. So if we're going to get feedback about, is the team heading in the right direction, we have to get a sense of how many different ways are being added to the code base of solving problems in different ways. And to do that, we actually need a pretty good understanding about what's happening as our code base is evolving. So I contrast this often when I think about sort of your ivory tower architect sort of pattern, which is, people who've kind of established some ways of working of how the team should actually design and implement things. But then you go to the implementation and you actually see it's quite different from what was kind of whiteboard diagrammed or sort of archetyped in a sort of Visio diagram. And what we're really trying to do as effective technical leaders is really trying to reduce that feedback loop of understanding when things are diverging away from this vision to what the reality is. And we're really trying to reduce that sort of feedback cycle. And so this is where I'm actually looking at this 30% of time of really trying to understand how well is it that people are understanding the directions as a team and how consistent are they. And it's very difficult to do that if we don't actually understand the code. There is another element to this, and I go to an article, it's actually quite old now, but still highly relevant, from 2009, and it's called The Unspoken Truth About Managing Geeks. And in this article, the author kind of talks about how the respect is currency of the realm, right? And one of the sort of patterns or labels that you might get named as a sort of tech lead is that, ooh, you're in that sort of post-technical camp. And if you think about that post-technical label, you have to think about what does that actually mean? What does that mean in terms of respect from the development team? And when I actually hear a lot of developers think about that, it's kind of sometimes used as sort of contemptuous way of saying, oh, you don't really know what our problems are today. And the advice that you're giving us isn't really relevant to what we actually have. And that's one of the traps that we can actually fall into when we're actually sort of suggesting solutions that don't match the reality of the problems. And so this is actually one of the things that I'm very conscious about, is that when I'm sort of working with teams, one really great way of actually gathering a respect is actually by understanding what the teams are struggling with in the code base, the concrete problems, and making sure the advice I give is actually relevant to the problems that they have versus some theoretical problem that the teams don't really understand. I think the other flip side of this is that understanding how our technology landscape is constantly changing. And, it's very difficult if we talk about the sort of three areas around people, programming, and process, to understand how you focus on developing yourself in understanding the latest sets of tools and technology coming up. And this is actually where you actually need to have some time with the code as well, which is understanding, okay, given some new tool or framework, how is that different from what I know previously? And so we actually also need to be able to keep our skills to a certain degree up to date so that we build respect for the team and we actually understand the implications of what those tools or choices are. The other side of this article is actually talking about the amount of respect an IT pro pays someone is a measure of how tolerable that person is when it comes to getting things done. And I think that's quite a fascinating anecdote that this author of this article kind of points out, which is sometimes in development teams, you'll have team members who are maybe not necessarily socially skilled, and the team don't like interacting or having conversations with them, but they're actually really talented at writing and solving technical problems. And the author kind of observes how actually a lot of teams would rather put up with somebody like that than a really nice person that can't write code. Now, if you think about it as one of your sort of team members, would you prefer somebody who can actually write and solve effective problems, but maybe has problems communicating, or actually somebody who's creating a lot of mess that you might need to clean up after some time? And this is the challenge with our sort of industry, is that it's very hard to get good technical people. And so one of the reasons that the author is kind of talking about this is that actually you need to demonstrate your competence in order to gain respect from technical people. Otherwise, they'll sort of slowly put you into the non-technical camp. And so one of the another reason, I guess, I want to make sure that I'm actually sort of working with a team is making sure that they understand that my skills are relevant and that I maintain that respect with that sort of team. Now, you may have the challenges of trying to understand how you spend time with the code, and I have a few concrete recommendations about how you go about sort of approaching this. So how many of you adopt sort of pair programming here? Okay. It's about maybe 30%. So one really great way of doing this is maybe doing pragmatic pair programming. So, a lot of pair programming, some teams go full-blown, where two people are sitting next to each other 100% of the time. I don't believe in that model all the time. But actually, there is a value in actually having people work on something and around the design aspects and trying to bounce ideas off about how you actually do things, as well as the continuous review process. And so in your role as a tech lead, you'll often have your time split across a lot of things. The 100% pair programming model won't work for you. And so one way that you can actually do this is actually through a pragmatic sort of pair programming sort of model where, as somebody is starting to kick off work, you work with that person to maybe talk about how you might approach it. You understand maybe the steps about the sort of tasks that might need to actually be done. And then you might let that person sort of go off, do that for a while, and then you come back and sort of check in with that person. And so you're sort of getting a pragmatic view of actually understanding what's going on with a particular problem, and you get the elements of pair programming without necessarily programming full time. And when you get the time, hopefully you can actually contribute things as well. Other tech leads I know spend time with the code base through actually doing a lot of sort of code review logs. So somebody might actually go through sort of the sort of Git or Subversion, whatever sort of source control that you're using, and actually just go through the commits just to understand how things are changing throughout the code base. I think it's quite useful to do that just to get a sense of how things are moving. I also would like to flag a warning here, though, that you don't always want to simply just go to somebody after you've been reviewing Git commit logs and say, why did you do that? Because people will think that they're being constantly observed and watched. It's more a bit of feedback for you about how the team is actually evolving rather than for feedback for individuals. Now, when we're actually thinking about the code base structure, one of the things that I'd be thinking about is really this idea about consistency over cleverness. And so this is really trying to balance out, the individual creativity of somebody who wants to be clever and solve things differently with understanding actually we care about how easy it is for the entire team to be able to do that. And so developers will naturally optimize for themselves, whereas as a tech lead, you're kind of worrying about the whole team as a whole. So you kind of want everyone to be able to move to different parts of the code base. And part of that is making sure we have a consistent sort of way of solving things. So I'm hoping that you never have any of these sorts of arguments about tabs or spaces, 2 spaces or 4 spaces, camel case or underscore, brackets or not, curly braces, end of line, or next line type arguments. And believe me, I've been on a lot of teams where people will argue passionately about these sorts of types of discussions. I've been even on teams where people will actually check out code, hit auto format, and then check it back into their own personal style. And for me, that's telling me, A, there's some passion, which is really good, but B, the team is kind of maybe focusing on the wrong sorts of problems. So syntax should never, ever really be a problem on a team of some sort. And your task and challenge is really helping people understand there are more interesting problems to solve rather than formatting problems. So rather than talking about stylistic things, we should be really talking about how do we solve a clever business problem with elegant algorithm or implementation? How do we make sure that we minimize the amount of accidental complexity we add to our code in the patterns or the ways that we're actually using things, rather than arguing over where those curly braces land? And this is one of those things where if you don't actually challenge the discussion, nobody will, and those conversations will go on and on. And so, if you haven't ever sort of run a what do we expect out of our sort of team as a development group discussion, it's really important to talk about that, to come up with conventions. And sort of code conventions are one aspect to that, but also pattern implementation conventions. So how do we go about approaching things about configuration? How do we go about approaching security elements? And how do we do that consistently across the group? There are other ways that we really should be thinking about consistent approaches and making sure that we align on them. Now, culture plays heavily into sort of the development team. And so when I'm thinking about the technical aspects, there are technical aspects to the culture which I'm always watchful for. So if you've ever done sort of continuous integration, this might be a common problem, which is how long does the build stay broken? Have you got a culture of the development team saying, actually, as soon as the build goes red, somebody on the team says, no more check-ins, we really need to fix this problem? Or do you get the other side of the, oh no, our tests take forever. I don't really know if it's actually going to be worked, but I'm going to check in my own code because I'm pretty confident it'll work. And so that's actually telling you something about the development sort of practices and the values that your team upholds, about do they really understand the principle of continuous integration, or are they just doing it because somebody has told them to do that? I often look for if people are avoiding conflict as well. So one really healthy sign of a good team is actually you should be able to have conflict and be able to resolve it. So there are two sort of symptoms of a very unhealthy team. So one is you have conflict and it just keeps escalating until you can't solve it. The other one is that everything's very happy, there are no conflicts here, but actually they're happening in the background somewhere. So, you might have people sort of checking out code and the reformatting as an example, and sort of rechecking that in. Or there might be other sort of snide remarks around implementation details about maybe something that goes unsaid. And so actually this is something that we need to foster, which is actually an open way of solving problems, because we need different opinions in order to solve a problem really effectively. I look for whether or not people are actually offering new ideas. So earlier I kind of talked about how our industry is constantly changing, and it's really hard for all of us to stay on top of all of the trends in the industry. And actually, we all have personal interests about what fascinates us. So it might be around, say, home automation, so the Internet of Things type things. It might be around hacking Raspberry Pis. It might be around infrastructure automation. And we'll all have our own sort of interests that, we might read about in our own sort of personal time. But we're not tapping into that potential if nobody brings up those ideas in the work context about what can we actually use and apply. Is there some new approach that we should be thinking about adopting? Or are people just sort of saying, OK, I'm just going to do the work that I've been asked to do? Do people flag for help? So a common pattern that I see if you're doing sort of daily stand-ups is, a dev who might have a sort of user story of some sort and say, I'm 80% done with this story. I'll almost be done. And the next sort of day, it's the same sort of story. I'm almost there. There's just one more thing that I need to fix. And then the next day is I'm almost there. I still have this one thing to fix. And what that's actually telling me is that there's probably some technical challenge that they don't feel safe asking for help. And actually, they'd be a lot more effective if they went to somebody and said, hey, do you know about this sort of problem? How do I fix it? And they could actually progress it as well. And the biggest thing is really also creating a atmosphere of vulnerability. And so, do people feel OK to admit being wrong? Now, the most powerful thing you can do as a tech lead is actually say when you've done something wrong or made a mistake. And that actually creates an acceptance environment of saying, actually, it's OK to admit when things were wrong. And we can't be right all the time. I always try to make sure explicitly in front of the team, I admit my mistakes because it makes it safer for people to talk about maybe the problems they're having and the mistakes they have. And that means that we can actually create a culture of faster feedback and faster failure, which means we can correct those problems earlier rather than let them sort of hide and build up. Now, the final aspect around the programming is really asking yourself, what is the vision that you're actually having for what the development team is heading towards? So I believe in today's sort of industry, we're actually quite bad at actually talking about architectural vision. What is the big picture around what we're actually trying to build or contribute towards? We're very good at sort of taking off bite-sized pieces, extra features, extra functionality, but how does it actually work towards this grander vision of what we're actually having? And I think it's really important that people understand where we're heading towards, because if they don't have that sort of common picture, then you'll end up with the 10 ways of doing things, or you might end up having to reverse and rework sort of parts of the system because it's not heading to where you have. And so one of the sort of exercises that I do with the teams that I work with is really making sure that at regular periods, so it might be, say, every couple of months, is that we get together as a team and we try to draw up what we think our system architecture is and how we're actually evolving it over time. Because there will be different parts of the system which will change significantly, and people's mental models of that system will really change, and unless we actually get it out, we won't be able to see where there are differences. So think about maybe how you're articulating your vision to the team, if there's even a vision on your team, and if not, what is it that you're doing to help compel people to help build something that they're really excited by? So we've talked about sort of the programming side. I'd like to move on to the people side. And this is actually probably one of the most hardest things for a lot of technical people. So one of the reasons for this is that nobody's really given us a lot of training or support around this. So for the people who have been playing this sort of tech lead role, you've probably been, like a lot of people I've talked to, thrown into the role because you've been maybe seen as the most experienced or maybe the most trusted. And suddenly there's a whole bunch of pressure. And suddenly you actually have to think about everyone else on the team, what they bring, how that actually works together. And we've often not given a lot of support in this kind of role. So one of the key lessons I've learned over time is actually appreciating that people are different and unique. And in this is that there's a whole bunch of things around strengths and weaknesses that people bring that give us diversity. And I think it's really important that when you actually think about your team, how diverse is that team overall? One of my favorite books in this area is a book called StrengthsFinder. It's written by a couple of people from the Gallup organization, and they've done a lot of interviewing, surveying with lots of companies around the world. And they tried to focus on what is it that made people successful in their roles. And one of the interesting things that they did with this book is that they noticed that people really focused on what their strengths were rather than trying to address their weaknesses, right? So often we're thought about when we actually think about personal development, it's like, oh, I'm not good at that. Maybe I should invest some time in doing that. But what they actually noticed in this book is that people who are really successful really focused on their strengths and amplified their strengths in the context of whatever the role they were doing. And they worked on their weaknesses by working with other people who had complementary strengths. And so actually that means we actually need a whole bunch of different types of strengths. And sometimes working with people who might have a different style from us, but they offer something different from what we have. And so this is really interesting when you actually think about your team and the diversity of the team, of how many different types of strengths exist within the team as a whole. Because if your team has, say, only 5 strengths, there's a whole bunch of things that they're probably not going to be good at as a whole. I'll give you some concrete examples of some of the strengths that came out of this book. So woo is one of those strengths that they talk about, which stands for winning others over. You probably know people like this, right? So they can sort of go into a room of random people, talk to people about some idea, and suddenly people are convinced that's the right thing to do. It's a very rare skill. Apparently only 1 or 2% of the population actually have it. But really good if you're trying to convince people to maybe adopt a new approach or win others over for something that you'd actually like to have. Maybe you're lucky enough in your sort of role as a technical leader that you already have the woo strength. Analytical people are quite important in our industry, right? Because there's a whole bunch of things that can go wrong. And analytical people are thinking about all the possible cases of what things might actually happen. And they're trying to understand all the situations, get a lot of information, understand the impact between that. And that's really useful as we have more complex ecosystems of sort of servers and applications working together. You have maybe the activator strength, and the activator strength is this thing, an ability about getting people started on something. So this is really about maybe the energizing sort of aspect of getting the team enthused about maybe a new working practice, a new technology or tool, and sort of keeping this sort of energy sustained. Perhaps you have people who have the intellection strength, about people who aren't necessarily interested about a specific tool or technology, but they're interested about the implications of the philosophy or the topic behind it. So, they might not actually care so much about, say, AWS, but what they're really interested in is, what does the cloud enable us to do and unleash, and what does that have in terms of our architecture? You probably, and I hopefully, have some people who have the strength of achievers. And achievers are the people who have this drive to have a sense of progress, this sense of getting things done. And achievers' strengths can be really useful, particularly around tight deadlines, because you need people to make sure things get done. Otherwise, the business will often come calling. Perhaps you have this strategic strength, and strategic people think not necessarily in the terms of like what's coming up in the next 1 or 2 months, but they're really thinking about what's going to happen to our industry in the next 2 or 3 years. It's another one of those rare skills. Apparently only 2% of the population have this strength as well. But it can be quite important when you're actually thinking about our technical vision, about where we're heading to, and what does that mean about what we might need to do now to prepare us to be ready for the future. And then you have people who have maybe the strength of input, which is making sure that everyone has a say and gathering lots of information from lots of different areas. Now, the book has 37 of these different signature strengths, so there's a lot more. But I just kind of wanted to point out actually what's interesting about strengths and diversity is that strengths give us a better ability to cope with lots of different situations. So, around tight deadlines, it's not really useful to have a team that is only intellection and analytical, because they'll just be thinking and talking without actually ever getting anything done. At the same time, you don't want a whole team of just achievers, because you might get the wrong thing produced because they haven't been thinking thoroughly enough about what the implications of what they're working on are. And so these are where the different strengths actually come into play, which is actually understanding different scenarios where those strengths are actually applicable. And it's not that a strength is bad, it's more useful in different circumstances. The other warning sign and the challenge for us as sort of tech leads is also understanding how strengths can also be a source of conflict. So I'm an achiever, so one of my strengths is achiever. And when I'm working with somebody who has, say, an intellection type of strength, I notice that we have different styles working. And very early on, I would always kind of assume, well, we're never going to get along because that person just wants to keep thinking and talking and never getting anything done, and I just want to get started, right? And actually what I realized over time is that these aren't necessarily about that person, it's about how they prefer to approach problems. And one of the really great ways of seeing people through a view of different strengths is actually a bit of empathy, of not saying that person is bad or wrong, but actually understanding they have a different way of working. And actually that can help people find a better way of actually working together, rather than sort of just continually butting heads about different styles of working. So, for instance, when I'm working with somebody who has that intellection, and I recognize that, we talk about maybe having some time off to let that other person think about how they might approach a problem, and then we get together, and then we talk about how we might actually start making progress. And they also have to acknowledge that I also need a sense of understanding how we're making progress so I can get a sense of achievement. So diversity can bring a lot of strengths and sort of give us ability to handle a lot more of different situations, but it also gives us the challenge of understanding where things might be conflicting, and we have to deal with that. Now, this isn't all just theoretical as well. A lot of this strength and diversity is actually backed up by research. So in a commercial sense, there was a study done which was around looking at Fortune 500 companies and looking at the composition of the board. And if there were 3 or more women on the board, you actually had significant improvements in all aspects of the business. This was from 2007, so it's a bit old. But there was one in 2012 done with just one female sort of member on the board. We actually improved the return on equity from 12 to 16%. And a lot of that's really just about this idea of diversity, of a different way of approaching problems, or a different way of backgrounds, and trying to understand where diversity comes from. If you'd like to read more about this, I'd recommend a book called The Difference. It's written by a professor from University of Michigan called Scott E. Page. He has quite a complicated mathematical formula, which I honestly don't really understand, but can be simplified to understanding how the strength of a group is really about how good the group is at its core, so the average accuracy, as well as the diversity of the group. So I'm not saying that you can go off to the street and say you'll compose the best team by just grabbing random people off the street. You kind of need people who have a background in writing software and understanding how to build software. But actually, if we have people who have different backgrounds in writing software, so people who understand algorithms, people who understand data structures, people who understand infrastructure automation, they bring in different elements. Your team as a whole is much stronger and ready to cope with many different problems as such. But there is a little sort of caveat, which is the star there. And this is really about this ability to integrate. And this is where your role comes in, which is really making sure that there is some diversity, but also the ability that people respect each other, that you can talk about these things and find ways to actually integrate different sort of solutions to make sure that you make progress. Now, the other side to people is really about how you go about sort of achieving that. And this is really about sort of trust building. Now, I think when most people think about trust, they think about sort of those one-day offsites where the team goes away and they do something like high ropes, and it's all a lot of fun, and then everyone goes back to their sort of environment, and then they go back to how they were working before. And my key message for you is really thinking about what are the trust-building exercises that you're encouraging to help people understand and empathize with each other on a sort of weekly or daily basis. It's not like you can go off and send a team off for a day and assume that suddenly they'll be the best team over time. It's actually making sure that you invest ways that help people build relationships. So, think about feedback on your team about how often that actually happens amongst the team that you have. Talk about how often people talk about their strengths and what they're actually doing and what their personal goals are. Thinking about about their personal interests and allowing them to talk about that in the workspace, and people grow an understanding about who they're actually working with. Which brings us on to the next sort of topic, which is really about your responsibility about growing people. Now, I sort of talk about there's this sort of move from being a developer, which is your maker mode, to being this leader. And it actually shifts significantly from doing, that's your making, to being a multiplier. You're really there to also amplify the effectiveness of everyone on the team. And this is where I like this model which talks about how you sort of grow people. So there's this sort of model called flow. And it's kind of thinking about how people grow and learn over time. So on one axis here, you can sort of see the challenge, and then you also have maybe somebody's skill in their ability to solve that challenge. Now, when people take on something new for the first time and they don't have the skill, you end up getting very anxious. Perhaps you've been on your role to being a tech lead for the first time. What do I do? How do I approach this? Am I doing it right? At the same time, if you do the same thing over and over again, you end up being kind of bored, right? So, oh, I can't do another MVC web application. I need something else to do. And so there's this channel in between, which is actually this flow channel of us growing and learning. So in order for us to get into this sort of state of flow, we kind of need something that pushes us out of the comfort zone. And this is something you can offer to people on your team. Give them something new to do that they've never been done before. Give them a challenge. And give them support so that they're not there to fail, but actually when they succeed, they'll get into this flow zone, right? So they'll get this buzz of, I've learned something new, I've done something different, and therefore I'm learning and growing. However, you need to watch out for people doing the same thing over and over, because they will end up sort of getting bored, and what they need is a new challenge to bring them into that flow zone. And one of the warnings of bored people is that bored people will quit. They will look for a place where they can grow and learn. And this is something you really want to be thinking about on your sort of team. So really trying to find ways that people can try something new, a new task, activity they've never done before, new technology, and support them and help them grow into this sort of flow zone. And this is, I guess, the idea of really being a maximizer and multiplier. And what I tend to think about with the individuals on my team is I try to build up a mental model of the sort of different perspectives of what they have. So what are the skills do they have, or what do they bring? What are their strengths? What are their sort of goals and ambitions at a personal level? And what are they interested in outside of work that maybe might be relevant? And what I'm really looking for is something that aligns well with what they want to do, that they're good at, that they have strengths at, and they'll be really successful, and it'll help your team as well. So even if it's something that maybe I, as a sort of technical person, might have been able to solve, if it actually hits this sweet spot, I'd rather give it to them, because they'll grow, they'll be really enthused, and you're helping to multiply their effectiveness. And we can actually influence some of these things. So with skills, we can actually send people to conferences like this, send them on training courses, enthuse people around that. We can help them maybe build interests, or help them maybe establish concrete goals. There's maybe less about what we can do around the sort of strengths. And around this is really thinking about how are we encouraging learning on our sort of team environment. So these are just a broad spectrum of lots of different ways that you might think about learning in your team. And it's such an important aspect of making sure that your team is constantly growing. So in order for us to keep up to date with all the changing technologies, people need time to actually do this. So you might think about the Google's 20% time, but you can actually think about how you spread this out over time as well. So how often do you get together as a team and do code reviews and learn something about the code base? Maybe share best practices that are already evolving, but not yet multiplied across the entire team. There might be external things like books or video clubs where you might take conferences, videos like from this conference, and then sort of show this and then talk about how it's relevant to what you're doing as a team. And so through that way, you're encouraging learning as well. The final aspect of people is probably one of the hardest ones to deal with, and it's really an important thing to remember, which is being aware of the bad apple. So there's a paper which is here called Bad is Stronger Than Good, and it talks about our sort of human bias around how in order for us to have to offset a bad experience, we kind of need about 10 good experiences to kind of levy that out. And so if somebody is actually acting negatively and having a bad impact to your team, they can actually have a much more significant impact than what they're actually doing to you, because they're having a negative impact on the rest of the team as well. And so by you not doing anything about that, you're actually explicitly allowing that behavior. And you have to think about what impact that's actually having on the team. And ultimately, you're responsible for the effectiveness for the entire team. And you have to be prepared to have difficult conversations with that person about maybe the behaviors that they're demonstrating, or the things that they're saying, and the impact that it's having on the rest of the group. And so it's really important that you really think about what you do about that bad apple. Often they're not really bad. There are circumstances of which you might be able to work with them on, but you're really responsible for dealing with that situation, because everyone else on the team will probably avoid that sort of conflict or situation overall. So we talked about programming, talked about people. I sort of want to move on to sort of process. And one of the hardest things that a lot of first-time tech leads fall into is it okay to tell people what to do? So as a first-time tech lead, a lot of people will be thinking, I need to make all the decisions. I need to tell people, here's how you go solve this. As a developer, that's how I behaved. I made all the choices. So is it okay to do this? And I see kind of two extremes of yes or no. And actually, there's a yes, but it depends kind of sort of answer. And one of the models that I find is really useful around this is really this one called the Situational Leadership Model. So you can kind of think about 4 types of behaviors of what you can have to help people solve problems. And it kind of goes through a sort of backwards curve, which I'll talk about in a second. So we can be very directing, which is actually about maybe me telling you what to do and breaking things down step by step. Or we can take a bit more of a coaching role, which is actually about asking people questions to help them find the problem solution that actually they can actually implement themselves. Sometimes we can actually take supporting behavior, where we're actually working on a problem together, contributing both perspectives and experiences about how we do things. Or we don't tell people what to do, and we just simply delegate. So people decide what they'd actually like to have. So there's a spectrum of behavior of how we actually interact with our team members. It's not just we tell people what to do or we let them do whatever they like. In order for us to actually understand this, we actually need to understand maybe where we actually go about applying this. And part of this model is describing where these behaviors actually are appropriate. And part of this is really a function of how good that person is in terms of a particular skill set that matches a particular activity. So this is thinking about whether or not somebody is developing or developed around that particular skill. So if you're sort of don't yet have any competency in a particular area, but you're really highly motivated, this is where directing behavior makes a lot of sense. So a really good example is we hire a lot of sort of university graduates who are really excited because it's their first time in the industry, and they've maybe learned about some of these sort of theoretical things, but they don't really know what it means in the real world. So they're really highly motivated, but they don't have that competency yet. And this is actually where breaking sort of things down into tasks and actually saying, here's how you solve that problem, reduces that anxiety of them learning something new. And for me, it would be very similar. So if somebody said, okay, I need to start setting up a machine learning sort of thing using such and such platforms, then if I'm not familiar with those tools, I want a bit more of a hands-on guide about how I go about learning this step by step. And directing behavior is okay. But we can't just always operate in that mode. And so as somebody develops sort of competence and skill, they'll start to ask, well, should we be doing it that way? And this is where you move into your sort of coaching mode of us actually asking questions to help them find the solution themselves. At other points, then, once you actually have sort of mixed competence and variable commitment, that's where you might move into your sort of supporting mode of actually co-jointly solving that problem together. So this is where you're actually working with that person, brainstorming solutions, testing out things, maybe writing code with that other person. And then if somebody has the skills and is highly motivated, this is where delegation works really well. So people will do the job and do it well, and you don't have to worry too much about it from your perspective. The other model around teams that is really important to know is around this thing about Tuchman. So it's quite an old model that talks about the stages of group development. So a lot of teams will sort of get together, and that sort of first stage is really this forming stage, right? So you are now a team, a collection of people working towards the same goal. And then what naturally happens is people start to understand people have different ways of working, they work differently from me, or they think differently from me, and that's where a lot of the conflict comes. And a lot of teams get stuck in this sort of storming phase. And this is your leverage point as tech leads, is actually understanding what's going on in this part and trying to surface up those conversations to agree on maybe ways of working, agree on code standards, agree as a whole about what's important for you as a group to agree on. And that's really about then establishing these norms. And then hopefully when you actually have norms, it's only really the time where teams get the benefit of actually working in teams, and that's that performing stage. Now, the model originally had these 4 stages, and what they kind of observed is that teams don't really last forever, right? So they form for a purpose, and then they sort of dissolve. And they actually noticed there was this adjourning phase, right? And you probably know this. When a significant team member has left, you have like a farewell party. You kind of grieve to a certain degree because there's somebody leaving that you kind of liked working with. And that kind of was this adjourning phase. But interestingly, what happens with this is that you actually reset the entire team process again. So if you add somebody, or if somebody leaves a team, you actually end up with a completely new team because the dynamics of that system are quite different. There'll be different responsibilities that maybe the new person wants to overtake that somebody already has. And maybe the person who left was doing things that nobody else is doing, so there might be a gap or a vacancy. And so this is actually where the team will start to re-struggle around understanding, well, who was doing that? And so you need to actually think about going through this phase and accelerating that once again when people get added or removed. But the key message that I want you to take away is that a lot of these tools are just models. And I really like this quote. Essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So hopefully this helps you understand how you structure your thinking about solving specific problems around programming or people or process. And my final sort of words for you is really making sure that you make time for yourself. So when you're actually thinking about this role, you'll end up with a whole bunch of meeting invites. There's a whole bunch of things that you feel that you need to do, and it can often feel overwhelming. So you never have enough time to do anything. And actually, to be effective, it's really important that you carve out time to think about how you are approaching a role. How are you being a multiplier rather than just a maker, and helping the whole team in these 3 different aspects of what we were talking about. And so you really need to find this kind of thinking time, and everyone has their own ways of doing it, but it's really important for you to be effective. You really need that time to think explicitly rather than just simply reacting to all the things that are going around. And I will say from a personal level that you'll probably struggle with this because as a developer, it's very hard to not feel productive unless you're writing code. And when you're in this sort of leadership role, you don't really have a tangible output with when you're dealing with people or the process. So you might with the code, but it can feel really hard because you're not getting any concrete output of what you're expecting. But this is where actually you really need to be thinking about on your sort of reflection time, where you're spending that time and what effects are you having that you feel that you're actually making progress in. So as an example, this is kind of a snapshot of how I try to think about my sort of time, which is both at the start and the end of the week. So I try to really think about booking out explicit planning time in my diary, so I sort of decline invites to meetings and make sure that people understand it's really important for you to be effective in order to have the time, and that you need the time to actually think about it. So in conclusion, the tech lead role is a really important role to help amplify the effectiveness of teams. And to be effective, you really need to think about those 3 aspects of balancing the programming, people, and process. And hopefully some of the tools and models that I've talked about today will help you in your role, or help you as you transition into this role to not feel overwhelmed. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any.
So how did you solve that formatting issue in ThoughtWorks? Do you have a company-wide formatter settings?
So the question was, how did we solve the formatting issue on our sort of company-wide sort of level? And I would say we don't have a company-wide consistent level because when we work with clients, we kind of adopt whatever the coding standard is for that group. And so when we work with clients, the first thing we'll do is, if there's an existing one, we adopt it. Otherwise, we're introducing a different way. Or if it's not, then we try to facilitate the conversation around, okay, what is it that we care about? We know that we'll have differences about how we format that. Let's agree on that. And often, let's automate that process as well. So both Eclipse and IntelliJ have sort of settings that you can actually configure to make sure that everyone has the same sort of consistent formatting styles. So the short answer is we don't solve it company-wide because for us, our software is very client-dependent. And so we really try to align with our clients on what they'd like. And if they don't, we help them establish one. Yes?
Do you have any advice on team sizes?
Do I have any advice on team sizes? So I prefer kind of smaller teams in terms of the classic 5 plus or minus 2 kind of level. But I've been on teams that have been quite large as well. But what it means is that you end up having to really monitor a whole bunch more people of understanding what things are going on. So obviously the team size will mean that the code base moves a lot quicker. So you'll have to be doing a lot more sort of code reviews. But if you're pair programming, often you end up sort of trading off speed for quality. So you might end up with less code, but the code will work really well. So actually you can scale up a little bit more with pair programming because the number of sort of code commits tend not to be as high. And also you'll have a lot more consistency as well. So I would sort of go 5 to 7 people, but it can go up a little bit more in terms of developers if you're doing pair programming, at least in my experience. Yes, in the middle.
Do you have any advice about sort of balancing getting people to work on the
So the question was, is there a way of maybe balancing about getting people, or trying to find a way that people can work on something that they're really good at, but also something that they'd be really maybe bored at? And actually, that's where I try to encourage people to really rotate and an expectation of people should try normal things or rotate that. So a really common one is maybe you get to work on the things that you're interested in, but also we have to rotate something that nobody really wants to do. So maybe nobody wants to be the build master of making sure the build is green, chasing up sort of things, and we sort of rotate that responsibility. So part of that is really just an expectation with teams about what are the things that we need to do every day that maybe nobody wants to do, but we all have to do it. It's not fair to maybe put it on one person. But actually, for us to have that, we can split that responsibility. But also then, that means you get to work on things you'd like to do as well. So my time's up, and I'd like to thank you for coming along, and I'll be here after the break. So thank you very much.